So we have two scrap sheets here, the Velvetone with the pebbly texture and the Mylar with the smooth frosted texture, and we're talking about what the differences are. Now working with the Stabilo pencil, if I go in and start drawing into the Velvetone by changing my pressure and how often I go over a certain area, I can create a gradient, right? And it's not a perfect gradient, but it's a gradient. If I do the same thing here, just to the naked eye, it is going to look a bit different. But here's the deal, is that because this has a pebbly surface and this is smooth, when I do that here, that gradient is actually composed of dots with spaces between them. And this is more of a solid coat of the black drawing material that is not as opaque. So the gray is achieved by, and here, by thinness. The gray is achieved here by the dispersion of black dots. Now I'm going to have you hand me the phone, because here I'm going to use a loop. So this is a little magnifying glass. I'm going to set it there, and
that's cool.
you can just see that it's granular. So we're talking about black dots on the peaks of the texture. And here we have that much less. So what that means in terms of our screen print is that this gradient on the Mylar will look very different once it's a screen print. The gradient on the Velvetone will look very similar to what we see right here, because each of those little black dots is pretty opaque, and the spaces between the dots is very transparent. Whereas here, a lot of what we're seeing is achieved by a thinness of the drawing media. That thinness will start to allow light through, curing the emulsion, and it won't print at all. So with this, instead of a nice gradient, we're going to get a tipping point somewhere in the exposure. It might be further down, it might be higher up, but there will be a tipping point. So instead of a nice slow transition from dark to light, we're going to go from solid dark to solid light. Whereas this, the gradient will hold in the screen because it is achieved via black opaque dots. So for that reason, starting this first phase of the project that you're doing, you're only going to make two film positives. You're going to make one film positive with Velvetone and one with Rubylith. Okay, I'm going to do a separate video about Rubylith, but for this one, it's enough to know that the Velvetone, that you can draw, and as long as I have the light source behind the film, that's going to give me a very good indication as to what it's going to look like in the actual screen print. Here I have a nice watercolor round brush. These work great with the liquid ink. I have, here is a liner. Notice how long those hairs are and how thin it is. So that's really good for holding on to a lot of the liquid ink and being able to make beautiful lines with that. This is what's called a rigger or a script brush. So again, extremely thin, but fairly long in relation to how wide it is. So I want you all to buy at least one brush that is called a rigger or a script or a liner. Rigger, script, liner, like this or like this one. So working with the golden ink, you do have to replenish the brush as you go, but it makes a nice black opaque line.
That's pretty.
And eventually, the brush will run out of ink, right? And I would need to replenish. Now, what would happen if I keep going and I eventually just really run out of ink? What's going to happen to that area there? Let me really point to it. So, where the ink was really getting quite thin, what's going to happen there? Well, a couple things. A lot of what we're seeing there will not show up in the screen print. It'll show up a little bit. And here's the deal, is that if I have a light source behind the film while I'm drawing, like this, and if I don't have a light table, I can use a window during daylight and look at it that way. That also works just as well. But if I have a light source behind the film, then anything I see, imagine a scale of 0 to 10. 10 is black, 100% opaque. 0 is 100% transparent. So if you imagine a number 5 right in the middle, anything that's 5 or lighter in gray or opacity is not going to show up, or not going to show up predictably. So anything you draw on here, you want it to be 6 to 10. If I turn this off, all of that looks in the 6 to 10 range, but it's not. I have to see it with a light source behind it, and suddenly it's no longer a 6 or 7 or 8, it's a 3 or a 2, right? But even so, and this is important, even so, if we imagine a cross section of the Velvetone, its texture is like this. Peaks and valleys, peak, valley, peak, valley, peak, valley. If I draw with the pencil dry media, it's going to put globs on the peaks. And the more I go over that area, the bigger those blobs become. But at first, it's going to put black blobs on the peaks, but not in the valleys. So the light will get through the valley, but not through the peak. If I'm working with the golden drawing ink, it's similar but inverted. The ink pools in the valley, but allows light through from the peak. In either case, I am getting opaque black dots with tiny spaces between them. That is the power of Velvetone and using it as a film positive. Because in either case, my gradient is not achieved by virtue of how thick or thin my drawing media is. Instead, it is achieved by virtue of black opaque dots with spaces between them. The more space between the dots, the lighter the gray will appear to us. So even with this section right there, I have some black dots in there in the pooled valleys that will still block the light. Not as many as this really dark area. So if you have a line and you want it to be dead solid, no light getting through, and you want a solid line printing in your print, then you want to make sure you're using enough ink that when you have a light source behind it, you're not seeing any light come through that line. But maybe you want a line like these pencil lines here to be scumbly, not solid. Then great, do that. You can also do things like you can put ink down, and while it's wet, you can smear it. You can use a paper towel or whatever. When the golden ink is dry, you can scrape it off with a razor blade. You can sand it off with sandpaper. You can even wash it off with denatured alcohol, which is a stronger solvent alcohol that we have some of it here in the shop. The drawing pencil, I can get that wet, like a regular watercolor pencil. I could get it wet with water and then use the pencil. Both can have really interesting effects. But the Velvetone is really very durable. So I could scrape away everything that I've done here. That's a bit of time and labor, but it's theoretically possible. So you can do a lot of give and take. I could be working with the ink, and I could keep smearing it and just getting like a ground, and then later I could go back I could just like, okay, that's just my ground. And then I could go back later and add really solid lines within that. So that way I'm going to have some quantity of gray throughout the whole surface, and I'm going to have dead solid lines existing within that space. So I hope that's clear. It takes a little while to sort of fully understand how that works. But when you make a film positive, people are used to drawing, right? And it's kind of what I'm doing. You might think like, oh, he's just drawing with a brush or drawing with a pencil. But this is not a drawing. The function of this, there's only one function of this, and that is to expose the screen. So people tend to think like, well, when I do drawing, I like to have a full range of values. Some of them, those values, very, very light. Totally understand. The problem is that really, really light ain't going to translate to your screen. If you want it to be a light value, you first have to get it in the screen, and then you can print with a light valued ink. But to get it in the screen, I need this to be opaque enough so that it'll block the light. Velvetone gives me more range within the limitations of screen printing than any other film positive type. But it too still has its limitations. And learning to do any kind of printmaking is definitely about learning what its limitations are in any one media, and then learning to be inventive within those limitations. So for this first project, you're going to make 2 film positives. One, you're going to draw with either the Stabilo pencil or this, or both, onto the Velvetone. And remember, you can give and take. You can add some, you can remove some. You can add more, remove more, add more, remove more, back and forth. So additive and subtractive. I'm going to switch to a different video for Ruby Lith. Let me watch this.